Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the biggest perceived showdowns in the Bible, faith versus works. Are they locked in a cage match, or have we been missing the bigger picture all along?
And to get a sense of just how high the stakes are, let's start with this bombshell of a quote. An epistle of straw. That's what Martin Luther, the guy who basically built the Reformation on the idea of salvation by faith alone, called the book of James. So why would he say something so harsh? Well, because a single passage in there seemed to threaten everything he stood for. And here it is. This is the heart of the issue. On one hand, you have the Apostle Paul in Romans saying, crystal clear, a person is justified, made right with God by faith, apart from works. But then you flip over to the Apostle James, and he says a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. I mean, on the surface, that looks like a head-on, flat-out contradiction.
So what gives? Is the Bible just arguing with itself? Well, the short answer is a definite no. This isn't a contradiction. It's actually a classic case of two different authors writing to two different groups of people and fighting two completely different battles.
Okay, so to really untangle this puzzle, we have to start with James. We need to understand what he was so fired up about. He was taking on this idea he called dead faith.
See, James wasn't arguing against faith itself. Not at all. He was going after a cheap counterfeit, a faith that's all talk. A faith that only exists in your head as an idea, or on your lips as a confession, but never actually makes its way to your hands and feet. It's a belief that has no pulse.
And he gives these two brilliant, absolutely razor-sharp examples. First, he talks about seeing someone who's cold and hungry and just saying, hey, go in peace, hope you get warm and eat well, without doing a single thing to help them. The words are right, but they're empty, useless. Then, his second example is even more powerful, demons. He says, look, even demons have correct theology. They believe God exists, and it terrifies them, but that knowledge doesn't save them. To James, that is the very definition of a dead faith.
So if that's dead faith, what's the alternative? What does a faith that's truly alive look like? Well, James gives us two powerful case studies.
First up, the father of faith himself, Abraham. Now the timeline here is absolutely key. Way back in Genesis 15, years before the famous test with his son, God already declared Abraham righteous. Why? Simply because he believed God's promise. That's the moment Paul loves to talk about. But James fast forwards to Genesis 22, the moment Abraham is willing to offer Isaac. James argues that this action didn't earn Abraham his righteous status, it proved it. It was the living, breathing evidence that the faith he professed all those years earlier was the real deal.
Now, just when you might be thinking, okay, so this is for spiritual giants like Abraham, James throws a total curveball. His next example is Rahab. And think about it. She's a Gentile, a prostitute, living in an enemy city. You couldn't get much more different from Abraham. And this is just such a brilliant way to make his point. The entire city of Jericho had heard the exact same stories about the God of Israel. They were so afraid, the Bible says their hearts melted. So in a way, they all believed God was powerful. But what did they do with that belief? Nothing. They were paralyzed. Only Rahab took that belief and turned it into a courageous action. She risked everything to hide the spies. Her faith wasn't just a scary thought, it was a life-altering decision that saved her entire family. That, right there, is living faith.
Okay, so we've got a really clear picture of James. He's zeroed in on a faith that does nothing. So let's flip the coin. What about Paul? What was his deal?
So was Paul, the guy who championed faith alone, accidentally giving people a green light for a lazy, do-nothing kind of faith? No way. Not even close. You just have to realize he was fighting on a completely different front against a completely different kind of enemy.
See, Paul's opponent was the legalist. This is the person who's basically trying to climb a ladder to heaven. They think if they just follow enough rules, do enough good deeds, and check enough boxes, they can earn God's favor. And Paul's message was an absolute bombshell to that way of thinking. He says, nope, you can't earn it. Salvation isn't a wage, it's a gift, and you receive it through faith.
And this is so important. Paul never once suggested that this incredible gift of faith would leave a person unchanged. He constantly argued the opposite. In Romans, he practically shouts, should we keep on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. And in Galatians, he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, things like love, joy, peace, patience. He saw these not as works you do to get saved, but as the beautiful natural harvest that grows from a life that's truly been saved by faith.
So you see, they weren't enemies at all. It's more like they were standing back to back, fighting off two different errors that were trying to attack the same core truth. And this right here just lays it all out. Paul is talking to the legalist, the person who says, my works are going to save me.
And Paul's message to them is, no, you're saved by faith alone, not by your works. Meanwhile, James is talking to the antinomian, the person who says, hey, my faith saves me, so my works don't even matter. And James's message is, whoa, not so fast. The kind of faith that truly saves is never alone. It's one truth just applied in two different directions.
A really helpful way to picture all this is to think of a tree. Paul is like the botanist who's obsessed with the root system. He's explaining how we get planted in God's grace in the first place, and that happens through faith. Then you have James. He's like the farmer walking through the orchard looking for apples. He's focused on the fruit, the good works, because that's the evidence that proves the tree is actually alive and healthy. You can't have fruit without a root, right? But a healthy root will always, eventually, produce fruit.
But James saves his most powerful analogy for the very end. It's a simple, unforgettable image that just perfectly ties this whole thing together. The idea that faith and works are inseparable.
He tells us to think about what makes a person a living, breathing human. It's two things, right? You need a physical body, but you also need the spirit, the breath that animates it. One without the other doesn't work.
And he says in the exact same way, faith without the works that flow from it is just a corpse. It's a dead creed. The works don't give life to the faith, they are the very breath, the very proof that faith is alive in the first place.
So in the end, that epistle of straw is anything but. It doesn't contradict Paul. It actually completes him. It gives us the full picture. And it leaves us with a pretty powerful question to take away from all this. If a dead body has no breath, and a dead faith has no action, what are the vital signs of our own?